Welcome, everyone, to the latest Detroit Lions Lone Wolves podcast. I am the Doc, John Macaroon. After a nice vacation, Christian and I are back today to break down everything that we heard from Brad Holmes, the general manager, a couple appearances with local media, spoke with Mike Florio of Pro Football Talk. We're going to recap everything that Dan Campbell said. Lots of news and notes happening around Florida and the NFL owners meetings. So much to get into. Christian, what's going on? How are you?
I'm good, man. How was your vacation?
It was great. You know, it's good to get away a little bit. Orlando, the sun. I mean, you come back to Michigan and it's 40 degrees. I'm not used to it now, spending a week in 80-degree weather. So I was excited, still paying attention to the Detroit Lions. But you look at it and you say, all right, the Detroit Lions now are coming into a position where we can kind of get a sense a little bit more regarding what Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, how they felt about free agency, how they feel about the upcoming draft, some of the free agency additions that were made, kind of the overall sense of the team. Now, it wasn't terribly earth-shattering, but you get confirmation right from the source when Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell spend half an hour with the media each and just kind of go over the offseason, what's been going on, kind of stamping their reasoning for a lot of the things that happen surrounding the Detroit Lions. So one of the first topics that people are interested in is, okay, why were the Lions not so much big spenders this go around in free agency? And if you're following Lions on SI, it's not terribly surprising. Look, it's fairly clear. The Lions are a draft and develop team. They invest heavily in the research that they do for their own players. And with, how the roster is constructed, with the culture of grit and resiliency and being able to compete, and they want players that want to push themselves to get to their potential. The Lions have not been, they've not kept secrets regarding kind of their overall strategy. But as the Lions inch closer to being relevant in regards to being Super Bowl contenders, many people thought and were hoping that the team would be in a position to maybe spend a little bit more in free agency. They did make a splash with the addition of DJ Reed spending, $16 million per season, but that was the only basically big splash the team made. And Brad Holmes was asked, okay, what's kind of the overall reasoning and give us your thoughts about free agency. And what Brad Holmes indicated, which everybody kind of understood, is that the Lions are facing some big extensions coming up with Aidan Hutchinson, Kirby Joseph, and in the future as well, in the upcoming seasons, they have some extensions that they have to consider and weigh, deciding who to pay, whether it be Jameson Williams, Brian Brandt, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs. There are players that are on this roster that are going to need some hefty cash moving forward. So the free agency splashes are probably not going to happen in 2025 and in 2026 because of the extensions. And Brad Holmes put that out there. Do you agree or disagree? Because as many times as he's been asked, are you one player away? Do you feel like you need to load up assets? The Lions are standing firm that free agency spending is to round out needs and is not going to be a situation in which the team is going to load up to acquire external options.
Well, I think with how well they've drafted, I think that makes that whole process and thought process okay. I think that when you look at what the Lions have done through the draft over the last several years, they've brought in all-pro talents. They've had 3 guys that they've drafted earn first-team All-Pro honors in the last 2 years in terms of Penei Sewell, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and now Kirby Joseph most recently as well. And the fact of the matter is they're going to have to pay to keep these guys, and they've already done that with St. Brown and Sewell, but now you're talking about Hutchinson, Joseph, potentially Jameson Williams. We'll get into that whole situation in a little bit. But I think that when you look at where the Lions are from a cap perspective, they don't have the resources to go out and get these free agent external guys at 4 years, $100 million. And I think Dan Campbell kind of touched on that Tuesday when he talked about the fact that, hey, the one difference with free agency is we don't know these guys. We don't know what they're about. And you can only learn so much in a phone call or a free agency interview with some of these guys that they would think about bringing in. And so I understand why the Lions are going the route they're going in terms of we're going to do this thorough work. We're going to find prospects that we like and we trust in the draft. We're going to draft them and develop them and then retain them and then use free agency to fill in the gaps. And I think that process has worked for them so far, and we'll see if it's sustainable. I think that the next 2 off seasons are going to be big testing points for the Lions theory because they're going to try to re-sign all these guys that they drafted, and you're not going to be able to go out and fill these voids with big-name free agents. So we'll see whether or not this process is sustainable. And I think the biggest thing for the Lions moving forward is right now over the cap has them with only $5.37 million in cap space for 2026. So they don't have the resources to go out and make all these huge moves and bring in external faces. So I think when we look at the Lions down the road, this offseason and next offseason and how they manage and maneuver this is going to tell a lot about the future success of the organization.
Yeah, and you look at it and you say, okay, there is, Brad Holmes used the metaphor of a budget, basically saying, hey, that you got to take care of your mortgage, you got to take care of your spending first before you take vacations. But it's a little bit of an interesting metaphor to dive into because I don't feel like, talent along the defensive line, talent at wide receiver, talent for the offensive line is a vacation. I look at it like it's upkeep. So I feel like his analogy is a little bit flawed in that you do got to continue to have the same foundation of success and a good foundation. And if you're a homeowner, you realize, okay, there's going to be some costs, homeowners association fees. There's going to be some costs that pop up, with the weather. The shingles are going to pop off your house. There's, upkeep with the lawn that you got to pay. And sometimes the, maintenance guy is going to up his fees and stuff like that to do more of the landscaping. So you got to pay those fees. You can't just say, well, I'm just going to pay the mortgage. Well, that's great. But the aesthetics of the home kind of continue to be upgraded. And especially if you're going to try to keep up with the Joneses, because the neighbor is rolling out with a new car every year. He's doing some things that are very interesting in regards to spending. And you feel like, well, you want to kind of keep up and always enjoy the opportunities. You know what I mean? And as someone whose lease is about to come up, you recognize that, all right, I got to pay more for the same car. I'm not going to just say, well, I'm going to stick with the same car. I want to get the newest car. So there's just a little bit of the opposite approach in free agency, which I understand. Look, there's a lot of ways to build a good football team. And that's why you have a draft because, clearly teams that win have a lot of young players that are affordable and also are talented. But when Brad Holmes discussed Za'Darius Smith, I think that kind of stamped what the whole concept meant is that Za'Darius Smith was a good player. He's a player that most NFL teams would want to keep on their roster. When the Lions were unfortunately besieged by injury, they were forced to go out and make a trade. And that kind of put Brad Holmes and the front office in an uncomfortable spot because they had to do all that research. They had to compete with other teams that were contenders to go out and get a productive defensive lineman to make the playoff push. Well, now I do think that Za'Darius Smith was pretty much aware that he was probably not going to have an opportunity to play with the Lions on his old deal. I think that the Lions are not going to just do that to players. But when Brad Holmes says, hey, we just couldn't simply afford them, that kind of stamps home that, okay, the salary cap is something the Lions are going to have to address, that they're not going to just, willy-nilly pay players and finagle the cap and make it so that the player that they want to keep that's young and productive, they don't want to have any handcuffs or anchors to be able to prevent themselves from making a move. But what was your reaction when you heard that the team is still in contact with Za'Darius Smith's agent, that the door is not closed on his return, but if he does return, he'd have to play on a contract clearly lower than what he could have earned based on his old deal? It makes sense, but I do think that there's still maybe a potential for Za'Darius Smith to play with the Lions, but I think it's a long shot at this point.
Yeah, it's a sign of the times. It's a sign of the times. The Lions looked at Za'Darius Smith's contract and said, we can't afford to pay this moving forward. And I think that all that tells me is that the Lions just remain that much more committed to paying their own guys. When you talk about what Aidan Hutchinson is going to command and what Kirby Joseph's going to command, and I think that they have so many priorities that when you look at the 2025 season and beyond, they're going to have to start making tough decisions like this. Like Khalif Raymond also had to take a restructure and a little bit of a pay cut as well. So when you look at some of these decisions that have to be made, they're all made with that end in mind, that we want to keep as many of these guys that we've drafted as possible. And that's what really this is all going to boil down to. I think that there's some more interesting decisions that they might have to make in the next couple of years when you talk about guys that they haven't drafted. One of them being maybe Alex Anzalone. Now, I'm not advocating for them to part ways with Alex Anzalone, but this is the last year of his current contract. Is Alex Anzalone going to come back? I think yes. I think that while he wasn't drafted, he's the guy that's become enough of a staple of this culture. He came in when Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell took over. But these are some of the decisions that you're going to have to make. And that's my point. I think that when you're that committed to paying your guys, you have to make these tough decisions. And I think that while Za'Darius Smith was just what it boiled down to was he was just kind of that end of season rental type of player with all things considered. I think he was the guy the Lions liked having, and he was relatively productive in his role, and he gave them a little bit of a shot of life in that pass rush. And I'm sure that, I think myself included, we maybe had a little bit higher hopes for what he'd be able to bring, but he had a modest production while he was with the Lions, and this is a tough decision they had to make. And I'll be interested to see if this is the end or if this is kind of the beginning of a theme that we're going to see over the next few years.
Yeah, and you look at it and you say, okay, the reason why there's so much clamoring for upgrades is that the team got hurt. You saw Aidan Hutchinson and Alim McNeill go down. You saw the impact. You see the moves that they made. They're taking a chance again on Marcus Davenport. So they're running it back with a lot of the talent that they had. And I think that what kind of makes things a little bit more difficult is that the last image, the last memory the Lions fans have is of the team losing to the Commanders in the playoffs. So naturally, I think that there's a vision and a thought that the team's not good enough. And when you have that thought, the next step is to say, okay, free agency comes along, and then that's the first step to get more players. But I do think that there is a legitimate concern from Lions fans that, hey, is the edge rusher position enough? Is the defensive line enough with the addition of Roy Lopez, who clearly was signed as a replacement for Alim McNeill? We now know, and it's not terribly unexpected. Basically, Dan Campbell was asked about the health status of some of the players. Clearly, it's an opportunity to learn about some of the health status of some of the players that are injured. But one of the players that's key is Alim McNeill. And when you know that he suffered the torn ACL in December, it typically takes around 9 to 12 months, to heal. And for, defensive linemen, it may be more on the longer side. So Dan Campbell confirmed, and it was pretty much known that Alim McNeill is not going to be available for the start of the 2025 season. And it could be into the second or third quarter of the season before you see the talented run stuffer. They did offer him, and he did, accept a lucrative long-term contract extension. So it's unfortunate that he got hurt, but I do think that, it's going to be interesting to see what Roy Lopez brings to the table and others as well, maybe even Broderick Martin. But what's your reaction to Alim McNeill, basically now knowing that potentially you're not going to see him around until October or November?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm surprised. I kind of dove into it over the weekend and took a look at a couple of similar cases with defensive tackles, both with Grady Jarrett, who's a more recent example, and then Chris Clemens, who's more of a defensive end, a little bit further back in the 2010s. But his was interesting because he suffered the injury in a playoff game. And so that, I think, is a good example of like how long this could take. And with Chris Clemens, he suffered that injury in the wild card round and then came back by week 3. So I think that was kind of the basis for what I was projecting for Alim McNeill. I think I was a little bit more on the optimistic side, thinking he could get to that 13, 14 game range. After what Dan Campbell said today, I would maybe go a little bit lower than that. I think, in the best case scenario for the Lions, you're able to get 12 games out of McNeill in 2025. I think that with the status that Campbell gave in his update, I think I wouldn't be surprised to see if McNeill started the year maybe on IR, or if they treated it similarly to the Emmanuel Moseley situation a couple of years back, where Moseley wasn't on IR to start the year, but he was a healthy scratch. I shouldn't say healthy scratch, but he was an inactive in 2023 for the first 4 games, I believe, before coming back in week 5. And I think the biggest thing with the Lions is you don't want to rush him back, and I don't think they're going to. And so, like I said, I would be a little bit more cautious with him in that 12-game range, that 11-game range, so that when he's on the field, you can get the best version of him. It's not he's out there physically, but he's maybe 80%, 85% in week 3 versus now maybe you get into week 4, week 5 where he can be a little bit closer to 100, because it's a grind and the Lions want to play deep into January and into February and play in a Super Bowl. And if that's going to be the case, he's going to have a lot of buildup and wear and tear on that knee again, and you want to make sure that he's fully healthy and ready to go when he gets back into action. So I think the Lions are going to slow play it with McNeill. I don't expect him to be out over half the year by any means, but I wouldn't be surprised if his absence leaks into week 5, maybe week 6, just because the Lions want to be as safe as possible.
Yeah, and the other key piece to that defensive line, and Brad Holmes emphasized it. He said, look, it's not that hard. It's not that easy. It's not that easy to go out and cultivate and add an elite defensive end. And the Lions always want to remind everybody that they believe that Aidan Hutchinson is elite. There's a belief, and he started to showcase that. Now, an injury definitely starts to, shake people's confidence a little bit in a player that is, a defensive player of the year candidate, but he suffered a significant injury, a leg injury. But as a reminder, and we put out at Lions on SI that Aidan's dealt with severe leg injuries before, and he dealt with it in college, and he came back even better. And his old college coach was asked about it at the owners' meetings, and he thinks that Aidan can, with his work ethic, with his talent, with the sheer desire that he has to maybe even, showcase that, hey, if you give me the extension, I want to live up to making north of $40 million a year. I do think that the absence of Aidan Hutchinson made people a little bit forget what he can bring to the table. Do you think that, based on what Jim Harbaugh said and kind of understanding the player makeup of how Aidan Hutchinson is a grinder, somebody that can work hard, and having come back, from a significant injury and rehab before, do you think he can even come back better in 2025?
Yeah, I think that based on everything we've seen as far as his recovery, Aidan Hutchinson looks like he's on track to be ready to go fairly soon. As far as whether that's OTAs or whatever, they may take their time with it and make sure he's ready to go for training camp. But I'm expecting Aidan Hutchinson to be close to the best version of himself, and it may not be right away. He may need a couple of weeks, or it may take a quarter of the year for him to get back to that game speed, that elite speed that he was playing at early in the year last year before the injury. And I think that maybe my expectations are a little bit tempered just because he did suffer a serious leg injury, and I'm not expecting him to come out and have 4 sacks in week 1. But I would be shocked if Aidan Hutchinson isn't that same, mid double digits, that mid-teens level of sacks in 2025, because I think he's going to be ready to go. I think that the time away from the game has fueled him. I mean, you talk about the hunger that he developed in wanting to get back for that Super Bowl. And since they didn't get back, he was able to kind of dial back the intensity of his rehab and make sure that he wasn't skipping any steps to get back. And so I think that Hutchinson should be pretty close to the best version of himself relatively soon. Like I said, I don't expect that to be week 1 or week 2, get your legs back under you a little bit. But I think by midseason and into the end of the year, he's going to be rolling. And I think that he could be right back in that defensive player of the year conversation, even if it's a little bit of a slower start, because once he hits his stride, I think the end of that 2023 campaign is a great example of what prime Hutchinson looks like into 2024. He started the 2023 campaign fairly slow, and he went a long time with a little bit of production. And then towards the end of that 2023 season, he really ramped it up and got after it. And he had that big game against Dallas, and that carried over into 2024. And so once Hutchinson gets hot, I mean, he's hard to stop. He's hard to stay in front of, and he's hard to block. So I'm really looking forward to the version of Aidan Hutchinson that the Lions get in 2025.
And now you look at it and you say one of the players that is going to be potentially eligible for an extension, and there's going to be some tough decisions made regarding his future. But Brad Holmes was asked about Jameson Williams and what he means to the team, and could there be potentially the decision made to exercise his 5th-year option? And Brad kind of indicated and hinted that, yeah, that's something the team could do. And the situation is this year coming up in 2025 is Jameson Williams' 4th year in the league. So the team has him under control for this year. They could exercise the 5th-year option. So 2025 is under team control, and then he could be under team control for 2026 as well. I do think that's the case. You have him around, just a little bit north of $15 million a year in 2026. So I think that's a fair number for what he could bring to the table. He may also sign an extension, look for an extension. The team could go the route of, franchise tagging him, making him, the average. He's get paid the average of the top players at his position. It would be, north of 20 million. So that would be something that would be intriguing. But at the same token, he may be wanting that security. And for the team in the cap, it's a little bit more advantageous to extend a player and kind of spread out the cap hit. But, there are benefits to Jameson Williams playing on the 5th-year option. I do think that the player maybe is not going to be as happy as knowing that he gets security, knowing that, his teammate Amon-Ra got 30 million. He also sees the growing market of T. Higgins, Jamar Chase. He's not at that level yet, but he's getting close real fast. So I do think that it's in the Lions' position. It's in the Lions' benefit to be able to keep him under team control. So I don't think it's a bad decision at all. it is, a curious debate in regards to these extensions, because clearly the team has said, and you can debate it all you want, Kirby Joseph's getting an extension. He's going to be highly paid, amongst the top 3 paid, if not the highest paid safety in the league based on his productivity and what they expect from him in the coming years. Hutchinson, similarly, now the growing market may make it more difficult to secure how many years and terms and all that kind of stuff. So we'll see if Hutchinson does get done before the season. And that may take a period of time. But you look at it now, and I think that I don't see any real cons to exercising the 5th-year option of one of the game's emerging speedy wideouts in Jameson Williams, especially knowing the team put in the work. They understand they're cultivating a young player. Speed, is not something that is just found everywhere across the league. So I think the Lions are going to exercise the 5th-year option of Jameson Williams.
Yeah, and they should. I think that this is the right move to take the 5th-year option and then roll the dice and see where the financials land. And if he becomes too expensive, then that's one of those tough decisions they're going to have to make. And Brad Holmes acknowledged that during his press conference on Monday at the annual meeting, saying that, look, it's expensive to extend a wide receiver, and it's not going to be easy. I mean, just look at what the Bengals did with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and yes, they were able to pull it off, but I mean, you look at some of the money they're going to have committed over the next several years, that's going to be a tough situation to navigate. It's going to be tough. And I think the Lions are already getting there with all the different extensions they've handed out and plan to hand out. And you look down the road, you're a year away from having the same conversation about Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta and Branch and Jack Campbell. Like, we're only a year away from that at this point. And you start to talk about the veteran talents. And, I mean, let's face it, St. Brown and Sewell is actually going to be on the 5th-year option, but St. Brown is heading into his first year of his new extension. So 3 years from now, you're going to be having the same conversation about Amon-Ra St. Brown, who could be earning even more money. And you talk about the franchise tag, Jameson Williams, you talk about the franchise tag potentially 2 years down the road. What's the average salary going to be for a wide receiver? Is he going to be making $30 million? Is he going to have is the franchise tag value going to be higher than what Amon-Ra St. Brown is currently making? Like, is he going to end up having to make more money than St. Brown? I don't know. These are just something to think about, especially as the salary cap continues to climb with all the new revenue that the NFL is pouring in. So we'll see how it all shakes out. I think it's too early to forecast at this point exactly what the future is going to be of Jameson Williams. But I'm certainly thinking that when you get down the line, yes, take his 5th-year option. But another year after that, I just don't know if the Lions are going to be able to afford to pay him if they want to pay Gibbs and they want to pay Branch and they want to pay Laporta and Jack Campbell. Like, it's just going to be hard. And I think that, his speed, obviously you can't find that everywhere. But yeah, I just don't know where the Lions go if they want to bring in another wide receiver and all that and still pay all these guys they still have down the line. So it's going to be a tough offseason here in another couple of years. And that's why I think this year sets that tone. What do they do this year? Do they try to throw JMO an extension while it's still relatively cheap and take a chance? If I'm Jameson Williams, I'm not signing it. I'm betting on myself. So we'll see how that all goes. But yeah, just so many interesting decisions the Lions have to make from an extension and roster standpoint. And it's going to be fascinating to follow along with.
Yeah, and now based on, what happens at the owners' meetings, there's talk about the draft and what the Lions could do. I'm curious to see if they look to another defensive tackle, maybe to compete with Roy Lopez now that Alim McNeill's out. Dan Campbell was asked as well, and he indicated that just knowing the makeup of the Lions roster, there's only 7 receivers, and typically they go with north of 10. I think they've had 11, 12 in the past. So they need some younger talent because remember, too, Allen Robinson probably has played his last down with the Lions. They moved on from Donovan Peoples-Jones. You still have some young options, but the Lions seem to be in a spot where they go, okay, we know what we have at the top. We know what we have in Tim Patrick, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jameson Williams, but we got to get younger a little bit in terms of the depth. And now, to me, these are guys that are going to be competing in practice for opportunities. And yes, it does allow the team to kind of have a player that if they want to bring up, if they draft a wide receiver, that can be more affordable on a rookie deal, as opposed to paying Jameson Williams $20 million north of $20 million a year or more, and then Amon-Ra 30 or more. That's a lot of money allocated to that position, especially with the depth that's available at the wide receiver spot in the draft. It's a position that most people believe you can kind of target, and there's plenty of options that can come in and at least get an opportunity in the National Football League. But I do agree. I think that for depth purposes, I do think the Lions can upgrade. And I do think they're going to take a wide receiver in this draft. You can check out Lions on SI, as we did a series where we highlighted each round of the draft, a wide receiver and every position that you can find for the Lions. So you can check out those stories at Lions on SI, one wide receiver of each round in the draft that we feel could fit the Detroit Lions. And I do think that replenishing that position will be key for the success of the team. And I do think that there's an opportunity to go out there. So any names that you recall reading, of the draft prospects that you think, okay, maybe a big bodied X or a speedy guy that could come in here and help out? I do think that it makes sense for the team to get a little bit younger at wide receiver.
Yeah, so two that immediately come to mind are Pat Bryant from Illinois and Jaden Higgins from Iowa State. Those are the two guys that I think kind of fit that profile right off the bat for the Lions. Pat Bryant is a big X receiver type of player, wide catch radius, uses his body pretty well, very low drop rate. So those are all traits that if you're the Lions, you love to hear that. And then Jaden Higgins, he's just a fun player to watch. He's long, he's athletic. He can be a burner, but he can also be kind of that in-between guy who can make the contested catches and move the chains for you. So those are the two big ones. And then if you want to go a little bit further down the board, like I think maybe Isaac Tesla, who's a Michigan native, he's somebody that maybe a lot of Lions fans are familiar with, played at Hillsdale first and then transferred to Arkansas. So that's a guy where maybe the production isn't super eye-popping, but I think that when you look at the athletic tools that he has, he's a guy that the Lions could certainly be looking for as maybe a late round pick, or if he slips off the board, then he's a local guy you're bringing in for an undrafted free agent or a tryout that I think that could crack the roster and make the team. So those are just a few guys. Trey Harris from Ole Miss is another one. If you want to go to like first round caliber talents, then I think the two guys are Matthew Golden and Emeka Egbuka. Both of those guys very disciplined. Golden is a burner. I believe he was sub 3 in the 40. If you're looking for another fast guy and you want to get him early, that's the type of player that you'd be looking for. So, yeah, there's a lot of options. This is a really good year for receivers, in my opinion. And that middle cluster, that second through fourth round type of player, there's so many good options that I think that could fit the Lions well. So it'll be fun to follow along and see exactly where the Lions go with it in terms of, is it something that you do early or is this kind of a day 2, early day 3 type of need? So this is another fun element in that, hey, they want to get a skill guy. So we'll see exactly where they go with it. But there's a lot of good options out there for them.
Now, the biggest takeaway that I think that Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes kind of talked about, and it was really highlighted by the general manager, and I do think that this is a situation in which they want the player to accept the message the right way. And in the National Football League, there's a lot of ways to send messages. You can do it directly, indirectly, but I think clearly when you go out and you draft a player at that same position, that sends a signal clearly to Derek Barnes that, hey, we're going to look at a player like Jack Campbell. That sends a signal, hey, that at any time an organization is going to search for better talent, for competition. And no player in the National Football League, whatever contract they make, should feel like their playing time is deserved. Now, you clearly understand that Jared Goff's going to be under center for a long time. It's just the way it is, nature of the beast. The Lions have tied themselves to that player. But for Hendon Hooker, it's a different story. He's a backup. He's developing. And, Brad Holmes indicated and Dan Campbell have noted that, okay, Hendon wasn't ready by the time the postseason hit last year. So they went out and got Teddy Bridgewater. They wanted a little bit more experience. Now, heading into 2025, everyone's kind of understanding, okay, Hendon maybe is not exactly where he needs to be based on his development. And they go out and they didn't make a big splash in regards to the financial commitment to Kyle Allen, but he's there. And Brad Holmes said, if Hendon wants the backup job, he's got to go earn it. And I think that's great. That's what general managers should say. No spot is given to any player. And for the Detroit Lions, that's just a staple of their franchise and the culture. But for Hendon Hooker, I do think that a message was sent like, hey, it's time to kind of take that step so that you are ready. So I do think that the goal for Hendon in 2025 is be ready when the postseason comes so that they don't have to look around for another veteran or that you don't lose your job to Kyle Allen. I don't think sitting here today that Kyle Allen's going to beat out Hendon Hooker in the postseason or in the preseason. But I would be fascinated because in those preseason games, you're getting a bunch of guys that, you're going to have his opportunity. I think Hendon Hooker will have his chance to play with some good players that are trying to make a team. So I think the competition will be fierce. I think that Allen will do his best to push Hendon Hooker, but to me, I would be a little bit surprised if Allen beats out Hendon Hooker. I think that Hendon Hooker was given the challenge. He understands it. It's a clear message. Everybody knows it. Hendon Hooker will accept the message properly, and I think he'll be the team's number 2 throughout the year and when the postseason starts. Could I be wrong? Do you think maybe there is a sign that maybe they still need to go out if it's not Kyle Allen? Because the Lions have shown they brought in Boyle and David Blau. They've had a myriad of competition, but do you think they still might need to go out and get a veteran that's had experience? I think a lot of people look at Gardner Minshew, that type where they've played before, but I'm of the opinion that if you can go with a guy on a rookie contract, I do think that the best option is if Hendon Hooker develops this year. What are your thoughts on the comments made by the Lions about Hendon Hooker and needing him to earn the number 2 job this year?
I love it. I think it's the way it should be. I think that they've kind of slow played Hendon Hooker's development with his rookie year. Obviously, he was injured, so he didn't get a ton of reps. And then maybe this past year, it was first full off season, and it obviously wasn't up to the standard to where they felt comfortable potentially rolling with him in the playoffs, which Jared Goff did miss a series, so he would have had to have gone into that game had he been active. So I think moving into year 3, it's time for him to step up and show even more growth. And I think we saw it at points in training camp. Obviously, the consensus was maybe he struggled a little bit with accuracy and some processing things, but you knew the tools were there. So now it's time to show some development, some grasping of the offense, which he did towards the end of the preseason last year. And it's time to take everything that he displayed that was encouraging last year and take it a step forward to where instead of being encouraged by it, now you feel confident in Hendon Hooker potentially going out there and winning you a ball game if Jared Goff is injured. So I think Kyle Allen is good competition for him. He's a guy who's made 19 starts and appeared in almost 40 games over the course of his career. At one point, he was like a legit starter, like he's trotting out there every game for the Carolina Panthers one year where he started 12 games. Like he was the guy. So I think that he brings excellent competition. He's going to show you what it takes to be that kind of spot starter and be somebody who that you're going to be relying on to go out there and win a game because whether the starter's injured or things of that nature, like you're going to have to go out there and win a game at some point. And that's what Hendon Hooker needs to be able to show the coaching staff that he can do. So this is year 3 for Hendon Hooker too. This is a big make or break type of year when you talk about his future, not just with the Lions either. I mean, he's got a 4-year rookie deal. So he's got at most guaranteed with the Lions at least 2 more years on that rookie deal. And then after that, if he's not going to be with the Lions after his last rookie deal season, he's got to go find a job and win it somewhere else. So he's auditioning not just for the Lions in 2025, but for all 32 teams as somebody who maybe they could rely on and be the starter, whether that's in a trade or signing him out of free agency if the Lions don't bring him back at the end of his rookie deal. It's a huge offseason for Hendon Hooker.
No doubt. No doubt. And I do think that the Lions have not shied away from publicly saying what they expect from players. And that's what's made them get to the level where they've gotten to the postseason, back-to-back division champions. So it's one of those deals where you get a sense, and most people's assumptions about certain players, you can debate a little bit, but not on Hendon Hooker. They want more. And I think that that's a fair expectation from a young player that needs to kind of take the next step forward. So the other aspect of the owners' meetings is the Lions definitely threw out some proposals, bylaw changes. They wanted to figure out like, hey, can we make it so that our plights a little bit better? And it was interesting to hear Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes talk about it. And they said, yeah, we were in a lot of situations where we had a good first down. We stopped the opponent. We got it to 2nd and 12. We forced that pressure. We got it to 2nd and 13. And then, that 2nd and 3rd down, we would just get that call around the 5-6 yard mark where the quarterback's moving around and the play's extended and the receiver has an edge over young, inexperienced defensive backs. And they're like, man, let's just not make it. So let's just replay the down and make it so that it's not an automatic first down when a defensive hold takes place. But that proposal did not get approved by the league. It got shot down. And you recognize, okay, other rules that the Lions kind of looked at are going to continue to be talked about. I think that's interesting in regards to the idea that you go by record if you are a team, an NFL team that, has a better record, like the Vikings, for example, had a better record than the Rams, but the Rams were division winners, so the Vikings had to go out. So the Lions could have been that team. They could have been in that position. So the Lions wanted to make it so that, teams that are playing a first place schedule maybe aren't as punished as much as teams that are playing a worse schedule, but end up winning and playing in a worse conference, in a worse division as well. So that is going to be continued to be talked about. So that's going to be interesting to look at as well. But, as they say, the Terry Arnold rule gets shot down. What's your reaction? Do you think that this was a situation in which the league was, maybe the owners understand that there's a value in passing the offense? It's so slanted. And look, I look at it like you always follow the money. You're paying quarterbacks 50, 60, pretty soon 70, 80 million. Word to the wise, make sure you raise a quarterback when you are blessed to have kids in a family. Make sure that that's probably pretty soon, in your time, it might end up being where a quarterback makes $100 million a year. And so you better get him in those passing camps right away. But if you're making that investment and you're throwing the ball, you want the reward for as many opportunities that you can to, utilize advantages that you have. And right now the passing offense is far ahead of a lot of defenses right now. What's your reaction to the Lions proposals and kind of what they threw out there? And this one getting shut down. The Lions did not lobby good enough. Maybe they need to hire you as a lobbyist to get out there and tell these owners, hey, here's why the Lions could have benefited, but here's why you can benefit as well. So sorry, Terrion, sorry, Ennis, sorry, DJ Reed. You gotta watch those watch those tugs, because when you it's one of those situations where if you breathe on a receiver, they're throwing that flag on you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I get why they proposed it. I think that obviously is very relevant to them, but I think that their defensive scheme just isn't like, I don't know. I just don't think that enough teams were affected enough by it to get a strong. I mean, you need it's not like a 50-50 thing. You need 24 teams to vote in favor of it to get it to pass, and I just don't think that it really had strong enough legs to stand on in terms of enough of the league feeling like they were affected by this. I mean, Dan Campbell makes a strong argument when you talk about getting a team into 3rd and 13 and you're playing physical and you get that 5-yard contact window and then contact happens 6 yards off the ball and it's a penalty and the corner is away from the ball because it's a play action play going the other way. Like, I get it. I just don't think that the enough of the league feels that way to get it to change. And then it's tough for the Lions, obviously, because they're really the ones that are affected by it the most. But unfortunately, they just didn't have enough sway with the entire league. I do think maybe the schedule one's got a chance now that they're tabling, the playoff seeding one's got enough of a chance because they're tabling it and they're going to discuss it later in the offseason. So I think maybe that one's got a little bit more of a chance than I initially thought. I like it. I like the idea of seeding the playoffs based on who has the best record, but I think that the other element that maybe gets ignored, and Dan Campbell did acknowledge it, is you've got teams that that finished at 4th place last year who are playing a last place schedule, and as a result, their record is better than a 1st place team that plays a 1st place schedule. So, I mean, those are all elements to consider. I think as of right now, I would be in the yes camp, but I don't see it passing. I like the idea. I just don't think like the defensive holding penalty. I just don't think it's going to have enough sway across the entire league to get it to pass, because this is an issue that when you listen to some of the other coaches talk about it, they're like, yeah, this is an issue we talk about I think Sean Payton said every 6 years this comes up. And he said he hopes to be talking about it 6 years from now. So I don't think it passes, but that doesn't mean I'm against it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and look, the good thing is that the other couple rules will be talked about further and maybe will be addressed in May. So it's going to be interesting to see. The IR rule at the beginning of the year, could be something. That rule with the home game, I think maybe will be talked about and some amendments can be made and kind of nuanced. Yeah. So I like the idea of tabling some rules. The tush push was tabled. I like the idea that, the league is looking at each team getting a possession in overtime in the regular season. And I like the idea that you can wear four times the alternate uniform. So I think that there's some things that can benefit the league as they move forward. But I also think it's smart where some rules that need some more nuance and discussion, that you don't have to have a black and white vote, yes or no. You can table it and address it at different meetings. So that's a good sign for the Detroit Lions that, hey, they're trying to at least, it's also a nice sign to say, hey, they're trying to at least competitively figure out ways to make sure that they're in the best position to win. And I like that, but I didn't have too much hope that a lot of these ideas are going to be changed, especially when you look at home games and taking some dollars out of I'm sure Sheila's getting a little bit of some jokes going, hey, you're trying to take some money out of our pockets here. You want us to have a less home games? We're trying to have more. One of those situations where it's always funny to see how things go with league meetings and stuff like that. So it's one of those deals where the league meetings produce a lot of interesting talks. You get a chance to hear and see a lot of good information. So overall, with our last couple minutes, what were your main takeaways, lessons learned from the last couple days hearing from, and I know we're recording before Rod Wood talks, and there's probably some business aspects and stuff with Ford Field. The international relationship with Brazil will be flushed out. Those are all things you can check out Lions on SI for future information. But the main lessons learned from the key figures in Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes, what were your main lessons learned from these last couple days?
Yeah, I'll start real quick with Brad Holmes because we kind of talked about it already. But my biggest takeaway was just their approach, and it was a lot of new information that I felt like we were excited to learn. Like you talk about the approach with the extensions and how they were honest about the fact that they couldn't afford Za'Darius Smith. Like this is a team that's completely committed to the guys that they've drafted, and so to hear him confirm that and be so straightforward and honest about it, I thought that was huge. So I'm interested to see how they progress moving forward. As for Dan Campbell, two things. Number one, they are not changing their culture. It doesn't matter who the new coaches are as far as coordinators. I know Kelvin Shepard was an internal guy, but like they are not changing. And they're going to use free agency to supplement the roster, but their full trust is in the guys that they draft and develop. And those guys become the leaders of the team. And Dan Campbell wants it to be a player-led team. And I think with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Penei Sewell in their fifth year now, like they're legitimate veterans. Like that player leadership is close to taking over. And you've got Jared Goff, who's been here a while now, and Taylor Decker, Frank Ragnow. Like these guys are player leaders, and that leadership is going to help carry them a lot further now that it's not just the coach being like, hey, this is how we're going to do things. Now you've got a locker room full of guys who know how the coaches want things done. And so now they can bring it all together. So that's really the biggest thing I learned. And then the other thing real quick to touch on is the offensive line. Graham Glasgow, obviously they have a ton of confidence. And then Christian Mahogany, but also Giovanni Manu maybe moving to guard. So that's something to keep an eye on moving forward.
Yeah, interesting talks. Now it's the push forward to the draft. They maybe make a move in regards to an offensive lineman, a veteran, to come in and potentially compete as well. I did find the talk about Graham Glasgow and the fact that they still value his versatility. A player that can play left guard, center, right guard is very valuable. And it's not new that the Lions like to try and have versatile offensive linemen, and they're going to try different combinations at different spots at mini camps and OTAs and stuff like that. So make sure you pay attention to Lions on SI, as we'll be out there throughout the offseason and the workouts and things like that. And we'll be here breaking it all down. But I learned a lot. It's always good. We can always speculate regarding what we think about the Lions, but when the key figures speak, it's very valuable. It's also good to hear a little bit about, what Ben Johnson said and about Jared Goff and joking around, and Aaron Glenn getting now a chance to kind of see the tree evolving from Dan Campbell. And you're starting to see and hear how they handle questions. Oh, they're ready. Ben Johnson has the script down. Aaron Glenn in full control of the media and how they address things. It was good to hear from Sean Payton and others, Shane Steichen, a little bit about the players that the Lions picked up. So there's a lot of information that's relevant at these meetings, and it's always good to be able to decipher and pay attention. So make sure you check in with Lions on SI as we remain in the mix to cover the team as we approach the draft. But now you turn your attention to the biggest time for the Detroit Lions is who's going to emerge as a player that could be a Dan Campbell guy, a Brad Holmes guy. And so we'll be here at Lions on SI to break it all down. And the Lions Lone Wolves podcast will be available a couple times a week to break down all the happenings for the Detroit Lions. So make sure you follow us on Twitter. The hub is at Detroit Podcast. That's where you can find the daily articles, the videos, the content. We just started a YouTube page, Detroit Lions on SI is where you can go find it. You can see all these videos, the podcast, now that we're back in the mix. Vacation time is over. Now we push forward to the upcoming NFL draft. Thanks, Christian. I look forward to talking to everybody again We look forward to it on the next episode of the Detroit Lions Lone Wolves podcast.